but I'm joined by my colleague Aaron Maté. Aaron just got back from a trip to Syria, on the ground in Syria, and set off a firestorm across liberal media and Twitter and all of the blue check marks who are calling him a genocide denier and a conspiracy theorist and a bootlicking Assadist. So, Aaron, I just want to start off this interview asking, what is it like to love Bashar al-Assad and to lick his boots?
You know what's interesting, and I think you guys have experienced this too before, you being in Nicaragua and whenever you guys go to Venezuela, once you get on the ground of the places that are so demonized and entire countries that are like reduced to a cartoon portrayal of one person, in this case, Assad, you realize just how irrelevant all those people are back home who sit in front of their computers and whitewash dirty wars like the one that was brought to Syria. So honestly, that whole thing was, I didn't, like when the Young Turks put out that clip of me saying that I'm paid by Russia and that I defend the killing of babies, I didn't even have the time to think about it much because, I was in a place that's actually been impacted by the sadistic dirty war that all these people who attack me are either completely ignorant of or who actively cheerlead, who consciously cheerlead a crime against a country. So it's just interesting always to be abroad and in the place that is impacted by people's ignorance and sadism that I usually live around, but was fortunate to escape for, a couple of days.
And Aaron, could you just talk about some of your report back thoughts, like the overall thoughts you had about your trip to Syria, what it was like, what lessons you learned, just in a nutshell, how did it change you as a person?
Well, to be honest, I came away filled with rage. That's my main takeaway. It's just anger. It's anger that, I'll channel productively, but you can't help but feel that way when you tour what was a once stable country. Before the war, it had one of the best medical systems in the Middle East, universal healthcare for all its citizens, had one of the best education systems. It was self-sufficient in food production with people's caloric intake at a level that's on par with, Western countries, which is considered to be, the top in the world. And you see all that destroyed because their government was outside the control of the hegemony of the US and its allies. And it suffered a dirty war as a result. And you saw what was some initial protests calling for democratic reforms being simultaneously co-opted and turned into a dirty war that may have been planned well before, for all we know. There's a lot of evidence pointing in that direction. So I was angry seeing a country that was once stable, full of just people trying to live their lives, being decimated and now being punished. Now the Syrian people are being punished for the fact that their government defeated the US and its allies. So these sanctions now preventing Syria from rebuilding, preventing people from importing cancer medicines, punishing average Syrians for something that they had nothing to do with, and for the fact that their country simply didn't want to be under the dictates of the US government. So you can't meet all these people face to face. You can't feel the complicity that, I have as a Western citizen and not walk away from that just feeling angry. And especially when you compare that, the reality on the ground, to the picture we got as Western citizens, just the nonstop propaganda that was used every single day, every single year for 10 years to justify flooding a country with weapons and fighters, letting Turkey letting tens of thousands of foreign jihadists come from around the world to wage jihad and destroy this country. And our media here in the US calling all these people rebels and freedom fighters, and not just our corporate media, but our progressive media too. So there's anger in seeing that. And there's also a certain irony in there's all this talk now, there's all this condemnation of Syria's authoritarianism. They just had this election. Assad was reelected with 96% of the vote. And I'm sure that this vote was not accurate. I have a hard time believing that 96% of the Syrian people voted for Assad. People told me that they thought that the vote was inflated. I would bet that they're right. But I also think it's so ridiculous for a Western citizen to complain or focus on authoritarianism in Syria and profess to be concerned about the well-being of the Syrian people. When, if we really cared about authoritarianism in Syria and the well-being of the Syrian people, there's an authoritarianism we can do something about. And it happens to be the worst form of authoritarianism that Syrians are currently facing. And that is the US regime, after destroying the country, deciding that it has the right to flood a country with weapons and fighters. And after losing that war, which left the country largely in ruins, after losing it, then deciding that it has the right to impose sanctions that prevent it from rebuilding. That's a far more extreme form of authoritarianism than anything you can accuse Syria of. Syria's authoritarianism is inside its borders, and Syria's system is Syrians' business. People in Washington, with the consent of the entire media class, have decided that it's their right to destroy a prosperous and stable country. That's like the harshest form of authoritarianism I can think of. And you can see the impact because people, that war was catastrophic. And now you can see the suffering under sanctions. There are long lines for fuel. People who can afford it, can afford to pay the inflated prices. But otherwise, people have to survive on a very low stipend of fuel every month. That's just not enough for them to get around. And then you compound that with all the other deprivations that result from strangling a country with the most intrusive sanctions program in the world right now, where any country wanting to do business with Syria, help it rebuild, can't do so, and because they'll be targeted by the U.S. or any company as well. And what's amazing is that, so we complain here about Syrian authoritarianism, but our authoritarianism passes by without even comment. So you read an article about Syria's suffering right now in the Washington Post or the New York Times. At best, you'll get a passing mention of the U.S. sanctions buried at the bottom. At best. Sometimes they don't even mention it. So my other big takeaway from Syria is that if we're concerned about authoritarianism there, we have a very easy solution as citizens of the West. We can stop our own immediately.